life had other ideas for me. So it was 2015. There was a lot in the news at the time about the refugee crisis in Europe.
As recently as Wednesday, the Prime Minister said taking more refugees from the Middle East was not the answer.
If we want to learn more about the world and about business and about all these things that can kind of better ourselves, then we should be doing more to be learning about things that we can really do to help other people too.
It changed my life, Grace.
The world kind of isn't built in any way for anything other than people who are born into a country that is welcoming to them just because they won essentially a genetic lottery.
The reality of the situation there was so different from the media portrayal of it, and the people that I met were so heroic in what they'd been through. And they said to me something that I'll never forget. It immediately made me realise that there was something really wrong happening here.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to get into this. I've read a lot about your story and what you've done and everything. And for people who don't know, could you give us a little whistle-stop tour of your kind of career/your work so far?
Of course I can. This is going to be boring for you because you know it all already, but yeah, I will. I'll start from the beginning. So my background is in ethical fashion. That's why it's very lovely to meet you. And I always thought that that was going to be my kind of purpose and what would be my life, I guess. That's what I studied and what I was very into, but life had other ideas for me. And it was almost 7 years ago, which is mad to say, that I had quite a life-changing experience and a life-changing moment. So it was 2015. And if you cast your mind back to that time, I think there was a lot in the news at the time about the refugee crisis in Europe. And I didn't really know anything about migration or refugees or asylum at the time. But I did know that my mum and dad were at the time going through the process of looking into fostering or adoption, because my youngest biological brother, so there was always 4 of us at home. I had two boys and 2 girls in my family. So it was always a big family. And then my youngest brother was moving out, and I think my mum and dad just had this fear of like having no kids at home. So they were looking into like what their options might be. And they were quite happy to take on an older child and to take on a child that didn't speak English. And they quite soon learned that there was a real need for foster families of unaccompanied children coming via the Calais jungle, which is that notorious refugee camp in northern France that was like in the news a lot at the time. So they live in Kent in the south of the UK. And I think that, yeah, that particular council was dealing with a lot of young people, a lot of young refugees arriving, and they needed families. And my mum and dad were open to that. So I guess I had this kind of personal interest in where my new brother or sister might be coming from and why they might have left their country. And at the time, I think I understood, or my understanding of the refugee crisis was there's a war in Syria and that people were leaving from Syria, but that was kind of the extent of it. So I basically had a curiosity, and that was like really, I think the driving force was that I wanted to know more, and I wasn't finding out what I wanted to know in the news, in our mainstream media. I was reading a lot of negativity and a lot of kind of dehumanizing stuff, but I was thinking about my little brother or sister that was gonna join my family. And so I basically decided quite spontaneously, I remember I had a Tuesday off work before going to a trade show on the Wednesday, and I was like, I'm going to go to Calais. I'm going to just find out, like very naively, but like see what I can find out for myself. So I packed up my car with like a few bits that I thought people might need.
You were going on that day?
No, this was on the weekend. I decided, I was like, oh, I'm off on Tuesday. My mum and dad don't live that far away. I was living in London at the time. You can be there in 2 hours. So yeah, I put some stuff in the back of my car. Like I remember my friend runs a restaurant and had like a booker card. So I was like, oh, I'll just go and get some like food. And I had no idea what people would need. Honestly, like I look back now and I'm like, yeah, that's mad that I did it like that. And so I drove there and I went, and it changed my life, Grace. Honestly, the reality of the situation there was so different from the media portrayal of it. And the people that I met were so incredibly heroic in what they'd been through, that it immediately made me realize that there was something really wrong happening here, the way that we are demonizing these stories and these people. So I met a lot of incredible people that day. I wrote about that first trip on Facebook at the time, basically saying that I wanted to go to the camp again and that people needed warm clothing, they were cold and they were like hungry during the day. And that post ended up going really viral within like the next 24 hours. I'm cutting a long story short here.
Yeah.
And we raised a lot of money. It was Just Giving's, at the time, their biggest crowdfunding campaign ever, which is mad as well. Again, this is 7 years ago. So that was overwhelming, and I didn't really know what to do with this money. So I started spending more and more time in Calais and really trying to work out how best to utilize that, working alongside the people in the camp that I was meeting and forming friendships with. And that was really the start of what is now known as the Worldwide Tribe, which is this a community, an online community, an organization that we have that supports refugees in lots of different ways. It's developed a lot over the years, so it's now really focused on awareness and advocacy, and we do our best to really challenge that negative narrative or that stigma that we still see in our news. And 7 years down the line, I now have 4 foster brothers. 3 of them still live with my mum and dad, and one of them is studying in London. And they're from 4 different countries, from Eritrea, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Libya. And they're my reason for continuing doing what I'm doing every day. They inspire me to do what I do.
Before we get into kind of the, your career and how that's been since that point, how has the process been? From a personal point of view, having 4 brand new brothers and getting to know people. And as you said, they didn't necessarily need to speak English. That wasn't a condition that your parents were kind of interested in. How, just from a personal point of view, I'm really interested in kind of how that development of that relationship has been.
Yeah, I mean, of course, each of them is different and each time it's been different. But I'm being really honest in saying that, like, it's been such a mutually beautiful experience all round. I think for my family as well, the original family, we have learned so much and it's been so enriching. I think that we've gained more than we could ever give in the relationship from the boys being in the family. But of course, it's been difficult and it's had its ups and downs. They had to go to our local comprehensive school and they didn't speak English, and there was a lot of misunderstanding around their stories and what they've been through, and all 4 of them have been through a lot, stories that you would never believe and things that are so difficult for your average 14, 15-year-old at school to even kind of comprehend. This kid has come from Eritrea without a passport, that he's travelled through all of those countries and across the Sahara and across the Mediterranean and lived in the Calais jungle and hidden underneath the Eurotunnel train to get to the UK without a passport, without any documentation, without his birth certificate. It makes me think about my first brother, Mez. Really wanted to join a football team when he came to the UK. He really loved football and he wanted to meet people, and he couldn't play for the under 15s because he had no proof that he was under 15. And that is quite an example of the way that their story has been throughout these years. Is it's kind of guilty until proven innocent, in a way that our justice system isn't like that, but our asylum system very much is.
And the world kind of isn't built in any way for anything other than people who are born into a country that is free and democratic and, welcoming to them just because they won essentially a genetic lottery to be able to be born in a certain place.
That's it. And that blows my mind. And that's something that I really want to challenge as well, is that why do we feel this self-righteousness as soon as we to have been given something that we didn't necessarily do anything for or deserve, right? And I can only relate it to, I was thinking about it because I was on a flight recently as well, and I know that you just got back yesterday, and it's like, you know, when you're appointed a seat on an
Yeah.
airline and you get the aisle seat, and like if someone from the middle seat wanted to swap with you, you'd be like, no. But you haven't necessarily done anything to like deserve that aisle seat, but like suddenly you feel like you have this ownership of something. And that's the feeling that I get very much from people here in the UK often, that confuses me, because like, yeah, surely we're all worthy or of having safety and security. Surely we all deserve to have those same basic needs covered.
And it's a kind of entitlement that we don't expect, or we don't even think about as the people who are entitled. Though I'm sure the second that was threatened for ourselves, the instant that happened, we'd kind of feel like, but I deserve this. Mm-hmm. Like, I have a right to this. Like, we talk a lot about like, oh, but you have a right to feel that way. You have a right to this. And actually, why on earth would I, just because I was born? I mean, there are obviously, even when you think about the UK, anyone in the UK, there'll still be huge disparities between the way and what people are born into. But then taking it even further than that and saying, actually, you know, even being here, even being able to exist as a woman or as whatever it kind of might be, it's an entitlement that we almost develop from birth. And I guess it's kind of part of a survival instinct, because, you know, there's a reason why these scaremongering policies work so well, is it's this kind of defense mechanism that we believe that we're entitled to something more, which is exactly why we don't want X, Y, and Z to steal our jobs, because we have a right to that first. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting that we're almost born with that. It's kind of inherent in our privilege.
It's definitely very ingrained, and you're right that like we're working here to unpick years of conditioning, a lifetime of conditioning that, yeah, is very difficult, because we have, I think, in the West, you're absolutely right, been conditioned to feel that way, and it's a difficult thing to challenge for sure. And the fact is that it's not even that our way of life is being threatened, and that's another thing that I feel is really important to raise, is that we're talking about a small group of vulnerable people here that are making their way to the UK specifically. You know, most refugees are hosted in countries neighbouring their country. Turkey has the most refugees in the world. Lebanon, a quarter of their population are refugees. Wow. And in the UK, it's like 0.01% or something tiny. It's like, I often ask people here, do you know anyone from Afghanistan? Do you know anyone from Syria? How do you feel that your life is being impacted by welcoming people who are fleeing these atrocities?
And it's kind of this survival mechanism, or this kind of defense mechanism that we have, that is so incredibly outdated, because if you think of the fact that actually, okay, way back when actually, if you weren't okay, because people were living in very different living conditions, and, you know, there will be obviously huge disparities in terms of people's living standards now. When you look at back then, when there was really a huge difference between royalty and aristocracy versus, you know, people who weren't able to, you know, live in any kind of standard that we'd recognise today, there was this, well, I need to be fine because otherwise I'll be pushed down that food chain. And actually, of course, that still exists in terms of disparities. But actually, as a whole, someone fleeing Afghanistan, being in this country, or however many people, thousands of people, would still not threaten your standard of living.
Or even the opposite. Like, it's been proven to show that refugees add to our economy, that they build our economy, that they are resilient, and like all of the things that you would look for in an employee. I feel like just by making that journey and being so resourceful, and that courage and that drive is one of the most, incredible skill sets that I've ever seen. Like, my 4 brothers, to do that before the ages of 15 just blows my mind. When you look at your average 15-year-old here in the UK, I can't imagine that they would be able to make that journey.
What I find really interesting about that is the stories that people go through when seeking asylum, or when escaping from a country and becoming a refugee, is the exact type of story that we'd herald as completely heroic and beyond, it's the exact type of story that makes people's success deemed that much more amazing, if that makes sense. So on social media, in terms of like an American college essay, in terms of like all of these types of things, that is the type of thing that would be like, wow, you're so great. The second it is from someone who is, either often not white or not from the Western world, or fleeing somewhere that you now don't think that they have a right to be in this country because they weren't born here, it's seen as like lesser than and kind of something we don't really want to think about and all of that. And how strange is that difference in perception between those two things, purely just because someone's not from something you recognise.
Yeah. And, I think that's become really apparent in the last couple of months with everything that's been happening in Ukraine, that the response to refugees or people fleeing Ukraine has been so globally different than I've seen for people fleeing Syria or Afghanistan. And that's really heartbreaking to kind of unpick, because what really else could be the reason, And of course, I would never want to undermine or diminish like how important it is for that response to Ukrainians. I've just been on the Poland-Ukraine border in the last couple of weeks, and absolutely that response is valid and necessary, but it just shows me that like we are able to resettle people quickly, we are able to put these programs and practices in place, and we need to do that across the board.
I mean, I saw the other day the Eurostar offering free tickets or whatever, and border waving kind of passports and all of this, and you're kind of thinking, okay, like this is fantastic, it's valid, it's necessary, it's really, really needed. But Ukraine isn't anywhere near the only place right now that is having that exact thing happen.
Exactly.
How can we actually look at that and think it's acceptable not to copy and paste those policies in order to be able to open that up to people whose countries have been experiencing this for long periods of time? It's not one or the other. It's clearly not, because the amount that we've been able to, you kind of think about it and it looks at it and it's like, is this just PR? Is this just self-serving, like, well done us? This is, whenever there's a big tragedy, but it's the one that's heard about most, you want to be seen to be helping it rather than helping things under the radar. It seems absolutely insane. No,
you're absolutely right. And, I met 2 Syrians on this trip that I've just been on for the last couple of months on the Turkish-Syria border in Turkey. And they had been through this mad experience where they'd actually left Syria and travelled through Turkey and crossed the Mediterranean to get to Greece. So they'd made it into Europe, and they're artists, they're amazing painters, they're fine artists. And they got to Greece and then they were deported. Their asylum claims were not accepted or heard, back into the hands of the regime in Syria, where they were tortured and spent years in prison. And then they just escaped and got to Turkey when I'd met them. And they said to me something that I'll never forget. One of them was like, I was in Turkey when the war broke out in Ukraine. And he said to me, why doesn't Europe want us? What did we do wrong? And I think that's it, it's that feeling of like people that are so forgotten about and put to the back of the pile and not considered in the same way, or their lives not seen as valuable as white Europeans.
Yeah, which is incredibly profound, and also just one of those things that when you really think about it, it just does not make a single bit of sense, other than when you think of it as being self-serving and racist. And kind of following on from that point, in terms of your journey as a whole, after going to Calais, you decided to change your career. How did that happen? How quickly did that happen? How did you make those moves?
Yeah, good question. And I look back now and I'm like, I don't know. It just kind of overwhelmed me. It was like after I'd been there, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. I worked at an underwear brand and I was like designing prints and just being like, I can't get this out of my head. It was this kind of unfolding crisis that was happening on our doorstep in a way that I felt like we hadn't seen before, or I definitely hadn't experienced or seen before. And I couldn't concentrate. You know, when like instinctually you just know that like that's what you want to put your energy into, and that's what's like buzzing you up, and that's the only thing that's like holding your attention. So I guess I just decided to follow that and started trying to juggle as much as I could, going to Calais on the weekends and like roping in friends and hiring vans and warehouses across London and having donation drop-off days and trying to coordinate like a logistical nightmare of like physical stuff getting into Calais. And I just felt like all of the time that I was using on my like working hours, and I don't mean to encourage, like I often give talks in schools and universities, and I'm like, shit, am I encouraging people to just like quit their job? And
I often think that for far less noble reasons as well.
Yeah, actually I kind of am, because if you feel that, I think that sometimes life presents you with something that you can either kind of grasp and be like, okay, well, I'm going to roll with this and see what happens. And it was a gamble, because my eldest biological brother at the time, we were living in London, and we moved back home with our mum and dad. And within a few weeks, my first foster brother, Mez, joined the family. So it was like all happening at the same time, that my mum and dad were worried about having no kids at home anymore. And suddenly they all moved back home, and Mez as well. They had a house full. And I remember that summer, because it was the summer of 2015, my brother had set up a tent in our garden, because like there was no bedrooms in the house. And we were kind of just spending as much time as we could in Calais. And then both me and my brother quit our jobs. He worked in advertising, and I think it was kind of unavoidable. We were like, we'll figure it out. Something will happen. And 7 years later, we're still doing it, which is mad. He now runs an organisation called Jangala, which was one of our first projects in the camp. So again, this was a tricky one to sell, because we realised when we got there that, of course, tents, sleeping bags, warm clothing, lots of those things were really, really key, and covering people's basic needs. But also lots of people were asking us about whether they could borrow our phones or our chargers, right? That like, same as if you or I were like in that situation, people wanted to stay in contact with their family or have access to information about like their asylum claims. And the land that the Calais jungle was on was this kind of forgotten piece of land with asbestos in the ground, and like it didn't belong to anyone, and it was far out of the town, and it didn't have much signal. So we kind of let people use our phones, and then I think we realized that there was only a certain amount of times we could let people phone Eritrea before we were going to have like serious phone bills. So basically my brother was like, right, let's do something about that. Let's set up a Wi-Fi network in the jungle. And again, a lot of people, I think there was even like a Daily Mail article about it at the time that was like, Wi-Fi in the Calais jungle, it's like a holiday camp or something mad like that.
Because that's what makes a holiday.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people, saying like, well, do refugees need Wi-Fi, or do they even have smartphones? But we're talking about doctors and lawyers and people that like
people.
Yeah,
like,
just people.
The dehumanization of like, do refugees need X? It's like, well, if we break it down to the fact that like this could literally be you, that is all.
That's it. And that's what I really realised in being there. I think that, like, I'll be honest and say that before I went to Calais, I'd never met someone that identified or fit into that category of refugee. And it's still not like a term that I like particularly use that much, because as you say, we're just talking about people, and it's something that happens to you, and it's circumstances that happen in the country that you were born in that you can't do anything about. So to cut a long story short, again, we set up the first Wi-Fi network in the Calais jungle, and we called it Jangala, after the jungle. And it was very popular, and we were very popular when it was working, but not so popular when it wasn't. And so we kind of navigated that, again, like finding people, someone who knew someone who knew someone who would know how to do that, and using this like amazing community that was growing online. And that now exists as an organisation in its own right, Jangala Wi-Fi. They create Wi-Fi boxes that operate all over the world. They're kind of self-sustained and they can connect up to 1,000 users at a time.
Amazing.
And they're built for this kind of environment, refugee camp settings or informal settlements. And yeah, that's what my brother still does. So somehow 7 years later, we're still here.
And when you decided to quit your job and you just decided, we're going to make this work, what was the initial kind of plan in terms of what you were making work? Was it general, just help where we can? Was there kind of one big goal?
I think on the boots on the ground at the beginning was like our main focus, that we were like, okay, this situation is not okay.
Yeah.
This camp, like the way that people were living there, and there was such a kind of pressing initial need at the time. But then the landscape changed quite a lot. More and more people started coming from the UK, and other amazing organizations, grassroots organizations and individuals started to come and like meet certain needs, like Refugee Community Kitchen doing food, and Choose Love doing a build project, and Care for Calais, and lots of people kind of meeting certain needs. And over time, I started to really realize where my skills were best used in this space. And I realized that like as many tents or sleeping bags that we distribute in this camp, the camp shouldn't be there in the first place.
Right.
No one should be living like that in the first place. So how do we get to the root of the problem? And I really realized that there was like an educational need in the host countries, in places like the UK. There was like a lack, there was like a gap between what people believed and the reality of like my brother's stories.
Yeah.
And there's an example of that I remember really well. I was in the bank in my mum and dad's little town in Kent, and I was standing behind these two women that were talking about Calais, and they were saying, oh, it's so dangerous, migrants running around with knives. And I remember that line really well because it was like really near the beginning, and I remember like not having the words to like butt in and be like, that's not true. But it stuck with me, and I felt like there were a lot of people like those women in the bank, and a lot of people like my little brother Mez, and I wanted to kind of somehow bring them closer together.
And knowing what you know now, what would you say the biggest misconceptions are about refugees?
Good question. And the podcast series that we're putting out next is really looking to kind of tackle some of those misconceptions. So I think a lot of the things that we hear on social media are things like, well, why don't refugees stay in the first safe country? Or that refugees are poor, that they're coming here for economic reasons, that they're coming for jobs, or that they're coming for something other than safety. Although the term refugee like actually means safety, or asylum seeker seeking safety. And that's something that I think, again, it's very clever that somehow we've managed to, or the media has managed to separate this meaning of the word, like asylum seeker, someone who's like seeking safety. We seem to have forgotten the meaning of that. It seems to have got lost somewhere along the way. But yeah, I think that refugees are all men, what else do people say? That they should stay and fight. These are the kind of things that I often see kind of come up, and they're the kind of questions or themes that we're trying to really speak to in our podcast series. So it's called Asylum Speakers, and we hear from people with lived experience. And we've just filmed and recorded the next season, which is called The Journey, and we followed common routes taken by refugees and asylum seekers from North Africa and the Middle East, so from the Syrian border all the way back to the UK. And whilst we were recording this, everything happened in Ukraine, so we shifted up our route and went more east than we planned, and included the Ukrainian border and that migration route from Ukraine. And the aim really of our podcast is to speak to some of these questions and misconceptions and be like, okay, why don't refugees stay in the first safe country? Well, let's look at what life looks like for refugees in Turkey, in Lebanon, in these neighbouring countries to Syria, in Egypt, the first stop for a lot of East African refugees. And let's look at their lives there and why it's not safe for them. And I think, again, that's a common misconception that somewhere that's safe for us, like France, for example.
Like going on holiday.
Yeah.
Turkey or...
is if you're going on holiday, if you're going for a romantic weekend in Paris, of course it's safe for you or I. And that's what I often ask people to try to do, is to look beyond your own personal experience, that it might be very different if you're a refugee.
For sure. And I guess it raises that question as well of kind of, we expect that because people have been fleeing war or, you know, regimes or whatever it might be, they don't have the right to go for what they want. They have the right to settle for the next best option. And like at the same time as it's like, you know, thinking, well, why do you want to move to Australia? Why do you want to move to like this? It's not because something is ticking someone's basic needs. That does not mean that as a human being, in the same way as it does not mean, you know, you need to stay in the UK or you need to stay whatever. It's this kind of idea that actually, well, you've had it bad, so you can just have it a little bit less bad, just because in our heads we can't, is that not being able to compute, well, if it was really that bad, you'd be fine with X, Y, and Z. And actually, like, sure, yeah, great that I'm not getting killed. Like, that's so nice, fantastic, thank you. But actually allowing this idea that, okay, well, if we have space, which we do, if we have jobs, which we do, especially, you know, if, for example, like a doctor, like it's no more, you know, no more worthy than anyone, you know, coming. But for example, you would let that person save your life. So why the fuck do you think that people, yeah, they could settle in the first country, but why is that any better for you?
Yeah, well said, mate. I totally agree. And I couldn't agree more that like people still have autonomy over their own lives, and they still have family members, and they still have wants and needs and goals and dreams. And if those can't be realised, like, yeah, maybe you're not living in a war zone, but you still might be fearing deportation to a war zone, or you still might not be able to work or study or pay rent or open a bank account in these first safe countries. And so is that, yeah, you might not be in fear of imminent death, but is that what life is about? Is that a good enough life for anybody?
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the kind of process of seeking asylum, I've heard a lot about just how backwards it is and just how little it makes sense. For people who don't know about kind of the process, would you be able to shine a bit of light on kind of what it involves when a refugee comes here and might want to seek asylum? Yeah,
of course. And that's another good misconception that I've just remembered, is like people should come here legally. And that's the issue, is that there are not currently legal routes set up for people from certain countries like Eritrea or Sudan. There is not an option for them to come legally. There's not a visa office in their country that they can go to and like put their documents down and like fill in some forms and wait for a flight. Like unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Otherwise, people definitely would do that. Yeah, people don't want to. At no point do people want to be hiding under a train. No, like exactly. It's not a choice. And I think, you know, like any parents listening to this, for example, like would recognize that you would do what you have to do for your kids, right? That like, you know, if you are leaving with your family, or if we all have that in us to like, you know, do what we need to do or do what we have to do to like survive. But yeah, I think the asylum process in the UK, again, is something that there's a lot of like misunderstanding around. So if I give you an example of my little brother Mez, or maybe I'll talk to you about my Afghan brother, because maybe that's more, people will know a little bit more about what's happening in Afghanistan recently. If you're like me, I'd never heard of Eritrea before I met Mez, before he joined my family, but they have a dictatorship and compulsory military service, and they use child soldiers, and that's why he fled. But anyway, all four of my brothers have a very legitimate claim for asylum, but my Afghan brother, his family were killed by the Taliban. He fled Afghanistan when he was 13. He crossed the Mediterranean. His boat capsized. It's a mad story. He finally makes it to the UK and he seeks asylum. And so you basically go for a rigorous interview and they basically try and prove that you're not telling the truth. They look for holes and inconsistencies. So because he didn't know the exact dates that the Taliban had killed his family, there was insufficient evidence and his claim was denied.
Right.
So then he was given a date where he would be deported to Kabul. And this is fucking wild, right? Because like this is a teenage boy who lives in a family who love him by this point, because also this process takes years. So going for the interview and getting your response, you're living in that limbo for up to like 2 years. So by this point, he's learned English. He goes to our local school. He's part of our family, and very, very much so my mum and dad would want to adopt him and look after him and like have him there
and
permanently.
also taking on full responsibility for that.
Yeah,
like,
100%.
You cannot imagine that this is actually taking anything away from the UK.
Absolutely.
I mean,
like my mum and dad are like, we do not need a penny from the government for this. Okay. So he's loved, he's in a family unit, he's happy, he's starting to thrive, he's starting to get over some of that trauma and some of the things that he's experienced and PTSD. And then he gets a letter saying you're going to be deported to Kabul on this date, on your 16th birthday. And that sends him into like a spiral of, you know, anxiety and issues with his mental health, because it brings back a lot of trauma and stress. And then we appealed it. And in this time period, by the way, that you're waiting for your first interview and then your response from the Home Office, you as an adult, you can't work in that time. So you're in temporary accommodation, and some of that temporary accommodation is like the craziest thing I've seen. Like, for example, Napier Barracks down in the south of the UK. It's like an ex-military barracks that hasn't been used in like, I think it was built in hundreds of years ago and was due for demolition like a long time ago. And there's been like fires there, and it's just like not suitable for like habitation basically. So because he was under 18 or under 16, he was living in our family, he gets denied and he has to appeal. And so we all go to court and my mum speaks in court, and it's a long, rigorous process and it's taking its toll on his mental health. And eventually he gets accepted and he gets the right to stay in the UK for 5 years. So that's the maximum that you can expect when you seek asylum, is 5 years leave to remain. And that's if you are accepted. And then 5 years later, so this is starting to happen to my brothers now, you have to go through that process again.
Fuck off.
So that's it,
No.
right? They're like, all my mum's friends were like, what do you mean he's seeking asylum again? Like, he's been living with you for years. And my mum's like, yeah, but it doesn't mean that then you're safe. Like, it doesn't mean that then you can't still be deported back.
And that's the maximum anyone can ever. Just 5 years.
5
again
years,
and
then you apply again, and then you can apply for citizenship. But this whole thing takes 10 years, you know?
But the thing that seems insane about that, I mean, there are many things that seem insane, but one of the big parts is surely that's incredibly heavy, like in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of the cost to the government, in terms of all, like, especially, like, obviously, in any situation, it doesn't make sense, but particularly if it's a child and they've been adopted into a family, that family has taken responsibility, which has, you know, they're paying more into the economy for this child, they're feeding them, they're paying taxes, they're doing all of these things that you would do that, you know, a child is involved in. And then to go through that again, once the child has also, you know, assimilated and kind of been, it seems not just unfair, it seems completely backward.
It's wild. It's the same with this plan for Rwanda. The cost of deporting somebody is not just their flight back to their country, but also the two people that like sit either side of them on that flight, and the paperwork. It costs hundreds of thousands of pounds.
More than putting them up in the Ritz.
For sure. And like literally, if you invested that into integration, it would be such a different system.
But then, and I don't suppose you have the answer for this. Why? Like, then the reasons
I ask that
must
every
be,
day.
yeah, no, and I'm sure. I mean, that's the basis of everything kind of you do. But in terms of you know, when businesses make decisions, for example, and they seem not to make sense, and then it's like, but because of this, or because of money saving, or because of that, it seems that every single part of it, so contribution to the economy, money saving, all of this, to me, the only thing that could feasibly, they genuinely believe makes sense, would be, because I know as well, you pay taxes long before you would ever receive benefits and all of these various different things, would be things like that they think are going to happen, like like risk of extremism, or, you know, all of these things that kind of fit in people's heads as, this is why I wouldn't let this person into my house, as it's like the blanket things that you can be like, this, you know, this wouldn't make sense. Because surely, I mean, it's not even like, I mean, we get free healthcare, sure. We don't get free higher education. We don't get, you know, apprenticeships, all of this we need to pay for. So surely those people would be contributing more than they'd be taking away from the economy.
I recognise, exactly that. And I see examples of that on a daily basis. So I think that it is a genuine, I think where it comes from is to perpetuate this narrative of, you know, let's demonise this small group of people, to distract, to take away from, to also kind of play into this narrative that, like, a lot of people that fed like Brexit, you know, like there is that, it's going back to what we were talking about earlier, like to feed into those kind of fears that people have, that like low level fear that we kind of we see as a society, to play on that. So
essentially it being a, you know, any anti-immigration stuff being quite popular policies with certain groups of people, and therefore it just being a card that can be played. I mean, it's very scapegoaty. It reminds me of other things from history.
Exactly.
Aren't exactly comfortable.
Yeah, I know. And it is scary to see that and to think about it like that. And yeah, I guess that's really underpinning the work that we're trying to do constantly, is to just try to amplify these positive, beautiful stories and people and experiences of firsthand. I think that, like, if you haven't met anybody from a certain group or a certain demographic, it's hard to relate, right? That's just like human nature. So I think that what we are really constantly trying to do is to, you know, Mez comes and gives a lot of talks in schools and universities with me, and I really recognize that, like, students, when they meet him and they hear his story firsthand and they see themselves in him, they're like, okay, now when I read that headline, I'm going to think about him, I'm going to picture him, I'm going to have his face in my mind, and that's going to disrupt some of that, I guess, like, dehumanization that we are seeing and feeling.
So I guess part of your activism then as well is, how do we do that on a wider scale? Because if, you know, if when people see reality, the reality of it all, they understand and they try and do more, how do we do that on a wider scale to be able to actually, you know, if it's a popular policy to put in place so that it wins votes, how do we make it an unpopular policy to put in place, aka by you know, rehumanizing and by sharing stories as you do? How, as part of your kind of activism as a whole, is that about putting that on a wider scale?
Storytelling, I feel, is really at the core of this, and doing so effectively and getting that out into our pop culture, into films and podcasts. And I feel that there has been movement and change and shift, and it depends on, like, you know, what is happening topically. But, you know, I think we all probably remember all of those years ago now when we saw those pictures of Alan Kurdi, the little boy who washed up on the beach, and how much that shifted the narrative, even in those mainstream media, like those newspapers that were speaking very differently a few weeks or days before. Suddenly, I think people felt compassion and that they saw their own kids or neighbours or grandchildren in this innocent boy. And so stories, I think, are really, really important, and amplifying those. And we do that in lots of different ways, whether that be person to person, so actually having opportunities for people like Mez and other people with lived experience who have been on the podcast to share their story firsthand at events or in the education space, but also online. So through the podcast, through social media, we try and use as many kind of creative ways to tell the same story in new, innovative, interesting ways as possible.
For sure. And I want to talk a little bit about your kind of life and career now as an activist. I know that you decided, I think what people will find really interesting is the fact that actually, it's not a purpose that you kind of had from when you were 10 that you realised and you thought, great, I need to pursue this. You'd gone through the education system, you'd gone through higher education, you decided to be a fashion buyer, and that's what you were doing. And then this is something that you discovered. In terms of that kind of discovery and knowing that it was time to take a leap of faith, what would you say to someone who's kind of had that moment and said, do you know what? I don't want to go to work tomorrow and do this. I want to do X, Y, and Z.
I think that we spend a lot of time in our heads busy with like logic and reason, and I'm very guilty of that myself. And the only things for me that I look back on in my life and feel like, fuck, I'm so glad I made that decision was when I listened to that like deep instinctual gut feeling. And it's hard to do. It's hard to like get rid of all the noise and tap into like, okay, is this fear or is this like, separating, like, is this telling me not to do this or is this just fear? Like, what is deeper? And I always ask myself, what would Jaz in 5 years' time tell Jaz now to do? Or I ask myself, like, what would I do if I didn't have fear around this? And they're like two of the questions that like just try and like reconnect me to that instinctual feeling, which I think is very often drowned out and very often the quieter thing.
No, absolutely. And I think it's it's really brave, but also I've heard it said a lot of the times where it's kind of like,
it's scarier not to listen to it.
It's
right?
exactly
It's like,
that.
I hear exactly what you're saying, that like, yes, listening to it is scary, but a lifetime of not listening to it, that's scarier to me.
That's terrifying, yeah. And your day-to-day as an activist and as someone who deals with something that's really, really profound and important must be really taxing on your mental health as well. How do you deal with that, and how do you keep going when every single day you'll see something that's like another bit of misinformation or, something that seemingly kind of is trying to discount everything you're doing?
But then every single day I also meet the most incredibly resilient, heroic people that are so inspirational to me. And I feel like if they can do that, I can do this.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like if my brothers can do that, the least I can do is this.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're so right in that. Of course, like I feel like I'm quite a natural empath, and I went in quite open, and I've learned to put some boundaries in place, because I did get to the point after like a year of working in Calais where it was Christmas. I remember it really well because we were kind of sitting around my mum and dad's dining table celebrating in the way that we always would, with like this feast in front of us. But I had changed so much in that year and like seen so much and learned so much that I was different, and kind of working through that was tough for me. Like I was kind of mourning this like previous naive version of myself, and the fact that like once you know, you can't unknow, right? But I'm so grateful that I do know, and I take that responsibility on board every single day to do my utmost to do justice to these stories that I now have the massive privilege of hearing.
Absolutely. And do you mind me asking how you're able to kind of fund your activism?
Yeah, of course. So again, that's been a constant hustle over the last 7 years, and a very difficult thing to navigate, because we live in a society where I think if you are working as a kind of CEO or a founder of a business and you're making lots of money and you're not doing anything to help anybody, we celebrate that.
Yeah.
But if you're making lots of money and you're doing things to help people, doesn't necessarily sit well with people, right? So, and I felt that very much at the beginning, that I didn't want to be like making money from this. But then I realized like, but actually, if I flip that and I'm not looking at it taking, I'm looking at like me giving my life to this, then yeah, I need to be able to like maintain that somehow. So I give talks in schools and at universities and in corporate settings, and I charge a speaking fee. And yeah, that has actually been the way that I have managed to maintain what I'm doing over the last 7 years. And yeah, different work with brands over the years as well, which has been really, really great. Have sometimes come up, and now that we have the podcast, we have a couple of sponsors for the podcast, which is really exciting. So yeah, different ways and a constant hustle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But before we move on from that, is there a way that people listening can support? Do you have a kind of Patreon or?
Yes, so not a Patreon, but we do have several fundraisers. So on our social media, so if you're coming through Instagram, we're at the Worldwide Tribe. Then you can see different ways to support different projects directly, but also our podcast to maintain that and keep that going. So there are options for you. And I always say to people, like, whether that be money or whether that be sharing a post, or there is something that's accessible to everyone. If you do feel this cause and you feel like it's something that you want to support, there are varying degrees and levels in ways that you can do that.
You should definitely have some sort of subscription. I think that, like, you know how we were talking about before in terms of the like, you have to appeal to people's selfishness, and part of people's for kind of people listening, we were talking before the podcast in terms of like, when you set up something for people to donate, they want to be able to see exactly what they're donating it to. They don't necessarily like to as much donate to like a whole, it doesn't give them the selfish feel-good feeling when they donate to a whole charity versus like an exact project. But the thing is with that as well, I think as part of, and you need to be able to appeal to people's selfishness to be able to kind of like, yeah, sure, we'll give you this feel-good feeling. Just give us this money to do this. And I also think part of that is people are so used to being able to easily subscribe to things now. And part of their selfishness is that people are too lazy to keep visiting things and donating.
Yeah, you want to make it easy for them. And also I feel, you know, with Patreon, a few people have mentioned this to me because it also appeals to that feeling of being part of something and maybe getting like early access to something or, you know, extra bonus like content. But I also very much want to maintain the fact that like our information and our content and our stories are available to everybody and that they're free.
I reckon set it up with no extra content.
Yeah, maybe.
100%.
Maybe you're right.
Appeal to the lazy people that are happy to like find a cause. Because if someone like, this is great. This is great. This is
what I need. Talk to me.
But I just feel that like if someone's listening to this today, for example, and is kind of really moved by this now, some people would happily sign up to donate to that on a subscription for the next year. And whereas even if you're moved by something so much, we're in such a kind of privileged world that no matter how much I feel now, like I'm unashamed, well, I am ashamed to say, but you know, in a month's time, you'll be thinking about something, reading about something, you'll turn the page. Like, and it's being able to hook people into that in a kind of, in the same way as you'll hook someone into, so, you know, for example, my business Shreddy, which is one of our main parts, is a fitness app. And we want people to be able to essentially make a commitment to themselves on the long term. And that includes it being subscription based. And that we've found it really helps keep people motivated because it's like, this is sorted for you. Like the whole economy has moved to like subscription based things because we are so lazy. And I just think that people should be able to be lazy and give things to you.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. And like you're making the cogs in my brain work because things have changed since we set up that initial Just Giving, you know, 7 years ago. And like people were just kind of starting to crowdfund for things. And now you're absolutely right that like we have to move. And over the years, I recognize that too with how things are changing and developing, and how people receive content. You know, we used to put out a 3-minute film on Instagram or social media and people would watch it. And now if it's longer than 15 seconds, people won't watch it, you know? And our attention spans are getting smaller, and our ability to kind of take in that information, I think, is getting less.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've got to make it super easy for people.
Yeah, that's the thing. And it's really like hard to even say, because it's like, okay, but you're giving your life to be able to do this, and people, you know, do what your brothers have done and have been through insane journeys and continuous trauma from even our government to just be like, oh yeah, you can live here, just like all of these other people who happen to be born here and literally did nothing to deserve that. And actually, but at the same time, you look at people and you're like, okay, but that's the reality. Like, someone will be moved by something one time and they need to have that like instantaneous ability to support by any of these things. I'm just interested in
maybe we could have
getting you more money.
follow-up chat, Grace. A follow-up chat. You just give me some business coaching.
But in general then, how can people support you? By listening to the podcast, by following along with what you do?
Yes. So the main way that I think is like easily accessible to everyone is starting these conversations and learning, educating yourself. That was the first step for me. That, like, as I say, I didn't know anything about Eritrea. I'd never heard of it before. Mez joined my family, and I think there is so much information out there at our fingertips, like literally in the palm of our hand. And like we have made it easy with the podcast. It's called Asylum Speakers. And
very good name.
Thank you. And the first 6 seasons have generally had one person. For example, my little brother Mez has been on there sharing his story. He tells it much better than I do. It's a mind-blowing story. That's a good place to start. I think it's episode 5. But yeah, lots of incredible people talking about their stories, and not just refugees and asylum seekers, but also people working in this space who have really inspired me over the years. And then the next season goes live on World Refugee Day this year. So this is going to be a shameless plug, but it's the 20th of June this year, World Refugee Day, and it's called The Journey, Asylum Speakers, The Journey, and it follows those common routes. So we actually did the journey and spoke to people along the way. And it really aims to speak to those questions that we were talking about before, those misconceptions, and to answer, you know, we've all got that family member or friend or colleague who maybe says those things.
The problematic uncle.
The problematic uncle. We've all got the problematic uncle, and you want to be able to have the vocabulary or the words or the information to say, like, actually, I heard this story and like, yeah, this is the case. Like, what you're saying is not true. So yeah, challenge that problematic uncle. That is where we can start. Removing
our own kind of desensitization that we've all had. I mean, when you say as well, like, having not heard about Eritrea, and then like talking about as well, like the regime and child soldiers, you think about that and like, what's insane about that is that probably, I know it doesn't for me, and that is, it's horrible. It doesn't, because you know these things happen and you've been able to be desensitized yourself from them. You hear something like that, and until you actually think, okay, what does that entail? You think, oh, okay, that's really awful. But you don't, in what world is that not something that is heart-wrenching?
Imagine if you went to, you know, it's Friday, right? And you're going out tonight. Imagine if you were chatting to someone British at the bar, chatting up a guy, or he's chatting you up or whatever, and he tells you that his mum was murdered in front of him when he was 2, and then he went into the army at 13 and fought for a regime that he didn't believe in and was forced to either kill or be killed. You'd just be like, what the fuck are you saying? Like, like he would be, that would define him as a person, right? Because you'd just be like, okay, like I've never heard anyone with like a crazier story than that. And some of the things that like I've heard people say firsthand, you're so right that like we almost are desensitized to it until you meet Mez. Like, I wish he was actually here with me today.
Well, he should come on.
Yeah, he should come on.
Absolutely. I would love to meet him.
Because he's amazing. And then that just like shifts everything for you. Like, oh my God, like you lived that. You actually lived that. And now he's just living life as a teenage boy in England, playing football and going to school and doing his A-levels.
As he should
be. Yeah. But yeah, what he did to achieve that and to get there and to be able to, he always says, I wanted to hold a pen and not a gun, you know, and to what he had to overcome to like have those same opportunities is wild. And why is it so crazy to think that we should all have those same opportunities?
Absolutely. So just continuously desensitizing ourselves and pushing ourselves to actually really understand the realities kind of beyond.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible, Grace. Like there is enough in the world. Like I totally believe in abundance. Like there is enough for all of us. It's just we need to redistribute it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It has been incredibly interesting to hear about your story and your work. And I think that everyone who's listened to this will be incredibly moved by what you've done and what you continue to do and the stories that you've told. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.